Good evening, everybody. My name is Maureen Lewis, and I am the Division Chair for the Division of Humanities and Natural Sciences here at Cazenovia College, and I'm also the coach of the Cazenovia College Debate Society. Welcome to the 16th annual, well, let's say that again, 16th annual Cazenovia College Debate Society Great Debate. Let's clap for that. I looked it up today, and we have more than 320 students over that 16 years that have participated in the Debate Society. Many of them have gone on to all kinds of careers that use effective speaking skills, advocacy skills. So we're thinking for the future. If you haven't been to the debate before, it would be useful to give you a little bit of background. The Cazenovia College Debate Society in its modern iteration was started by students. A group of students approached me in 2001 and asked about learning how to debate. And that was a time in our country after the 2000 election where we were all thinking about the importance of language and the presidential process. Of course, we couldn't have known what it would look like now. But those students worked really hard to have a very successful first debate, which they did. And that, I give them all the credit for laying the groundwork that led to the kind of debate program that we have today. Cazenovia has an inclusive debate program. Okay, what does that mean? An inclusive debate program means every student in the debate society participates in the great debate. There's no cut here. If you go to intercollegiate debate situation, many times it's 2 people or 4 people. And here, part of being in debate is participating in the stressful event that we're having right now. So it's a hybrid debate format. That means that some of the advocates will deliver prepared arguments, kind of classic oration in that sense. Some students will be participating in cross-examination, which means that there will be 2 advocates up here at the same time. One will ask a question and the other will answer, and then they'll change roles. One will ask a question and the other will answer. There'll be 3 pairs of those. Then it's really all about you, because we're going to have questions from the audience at that point. Advocates will come up one at a time, and we will direct you to ask a question. We have one of our first-year communication studies students, Liz, will have a microphone so that we'll be able to hear you on the webcast. You know, you're live in Italy right now, no pressure. And then we'll have rebuttal statements and closing arguments. So we're intertwining a range of advocacy approaches in this one event. I would like to thank our judges tonight. We have 4 judges with us. Interim President Marjorie Panay, Dr. Heather Ferrara, Professor of Communication Studies, Professor Stu Weissman, Division Chair for the Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and Rachel Bowman, Cazenovia College, class of 2011, and former member of the Debate Society. Let's clap for that. It's clappy. Clappy's good. Okay, now, everybody needs to silence their cell phones. And if I catch you texting during the debate, I'm not above embarrassing you. So don't do that, okay? Turn your phone into the silent position, okay? And actually, that's important because all of the advocates tonight speak on a time limit, and they cannot go over that limit. So a distraction like that could be the difference between somebody making their time cut or not. So it would be really good to work together on that. After we conclude with the arguments, the judges will tally the scores, and we will announce the team winner tonight. I would suggest to you, though, that a lot of winning has already happened. Many of the students have made very, very impressive gains during the course of the semester. I'm very excited to see what they'll do. So thanks for coming, and let's begin. Okay. To begin tonight, the opening argument for the affirmative team will be delivered by Alexandra Miller. Alexandra, you will have up to 4 minutes to deliver your argument. You may begin when you are ready.
Do you have the right to vote? According to data collected from the California Institute of Technology and the MIT Voting Technology Project, in the 2008 election, 2 to 3 million voters were prevented from voting because of various administrative problems, and 9 million eligible Americans were not registered because of residency rules or registration deadlines. The United States Census Bureau indicates that today, approximately 51 million eligible Americans are still not registered to vote. No person should be turned away from voting due to registration deadlines or various administrative problems. For these reasons, same-day voter registration should be available in New York State. What is same-day voter registration? Same-day voter registration is defined as a process that allows eligible voters to register, to vote, and cast their ballots on the same day. This one-step process can be offered for registering and voting may be offered on election day, during the early voting period, or both. Eligible voters can use same-day voter registration to correct an outdated voter registration record and cast a ballot that will be counted. Same-day voter registration is not currently available in New York. New York law states that registration must be completed 25 days prior to the day of election. What happens if the voter is told they cannot vote after registration due to clerical errors? They are then given the option to fill out a provisional ballot, also known as an affidavit ballot in the state of New York. A provisional ballot is used to record a vote when there are questions about a given voter's eligibility. A provisional ballot would be cast when the voter's name does not appear on the list of registered voters for that given precinct, or the voter refuses to show photo ID in regions that require one. Many times, provisional ballots ultimately do not end up as a full legal ballot and are thrown out. According to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, nationwide, approximately 33% of provisional ballots were not counted in the 2008 general election. That means that over 500,000 citizens' votes did not count. It does not have to be this way. There are currently 10 states that have already enacted same-day voter registration on a trial or permanent basis to great success. An example is Minnesota, which saw an 18% increase in voter turnout during the 2012 general election. That's 527,867 votes. The opposition will no doubt bring up the potential for voter fraud that comes with same-day voter registration. They may even stress the importance of mandated voter registration ID laws. However, what they will not tell you is the huge impact that same-day voter registration could have on the turnout of voters. All votes should matter. Former President Jimmy Carter has been active in monitoring elections around the world. He states, "The experience of democracy is like the experience of life itself, always changing, infinite in its varieties, sometimes turbulent, and all the more valuable for having been tested by adversity." The voting system should remain stable, but it should not stand still. That has been made evident by women, Black people, and anyone who was once denied the right to vote, but now has it. The public has the right for their votes to count and mean something. That is why same-day voter registration should be available in New York State. Thank you.
The opening argument for the opposition team will be delivered by David Clark Smith. David, you will have up to 4 minutes to deliver your argument, and you may begin when you are ready.
In arguing against same-day registration, or what I'll just call SDR, I could examine the ancient Athenian roots in democracy or the founding fathers' concerns which led to checks and balances, etc. But due to time constraints, everyone here is spared from such verbal drudgery. Besides, for those who feel that voting is an act that requires forethought, no demonstration is needed for the virtues of advanced registration. For everyone else, the balance of inclusiveness and responsibility that we already have is revealed in Article 2 of the Constitution of New York State, which sums, if you're a U.S. citizen, over 18, a resident of at least 30 days, and don't have any record of bribery or heinous crime, you can register to vote in New York, regardless of your gender, ethnicity, religion, or economic status. It then provides for registration laws around 25 days prior, so that at the polling place, all you need is your signature. There are currently no poll taxes, literary tests, or ID card requirements. And registration is pretty easy. Even online at the DMV website, Governor Cuomo has said he would even like to see automatic registration via the DMV. You no doubt will hear from the proponents of SDR that voter turnout in New York is declining. It's true. Data from the Board of Elections shows that turnout is down from over 75% in 1982 to less than 32% of registered voters in 2014. That's 32% of registered voters. With this in mind, and the ease of registration, it seems that efforts to motivate more already registered voters would make more sense than SDR. The recent surge in voter registration for the New York State primaries also suggests that voter engagement is more of a factor. No SDR is needed when candidates have such relatable names like Bernie, Ted, Hillary, the Donald. In all seriousness, SDR does pose some real potential problems, like costs and logistics. With SDR, how could one estimate how many voters would show up? Polling places would be either over or understaffed, have too many or not enough machines. There's also development and deployment costs for instant verification. Or worse, it could cause, with perceived risks of fraud, demands for discriminatory voter ID laws. States that have SDR may claim a mild increase in turnout, but have issues as well. California, which recently made SDR law, is having problems implementing it, and it won't even be in place for a few more election cycles. These states also have political polarization, partisanship, and distractions over the issue, like there isn't enough of that already. So, rather than risk the functioning and accessible election system we now have to the costs, complications, perceived fraud, and even voter suppression that SDR could cause, efforts should instead be made in motivating those that have already registered to proceed with the same consideration and show up on Election Day. Thank you.
The second opening argument for the affirmative team will be delivered by Dante Williams. Dante, you will have up to 3 minutes to deliver your argument, and you may begin when you are ready.
A recent headline reads, "Students being rejected from the polls because of North Carolina's voter ID law." Bob Hall, the executive director of Democracy in North Carolina, told Think Progress that the voter protection hotline is receiving many calls, disproportionately from young people and students. Younger voters are being told that they don't have an acceptable ID, so they have to go through the maze of filling out forms and provisional ballots. This means that younger voters may not be counted. As Mr. Hall states, because this is so much affecting our young people, we are teaching them the wrong lesson about democracy and voting. The challenges that these young people face when they are unable to vote or being rejected from voting can cause voter apathy. Voter apathy is defined as a lack of voting, which can cause low turnout rates. These issues impact minority voters too. Early voting data shows that black voters make up 22% of North Carolina's voting population, while they count for 26% for those who have said they have reasonable impediment for not having an acceptable ID. How do you all feel about this? After hearing this horrifying statistic, this should all matter to you all because this can't be you. This can be you. One reason that my team and I support same-day voter registration is because it will increase voter turnout rates. An article in the Huffington Post titled "Most Americans Want Their State to Make Voter Registration Easier" reports that a majority of Americans say they'd favor an automatic registration law in their state, while 55% favor allowing citizens to register on the day of an election. Another reason that my team and I support same-day voter registration is because of the availability of technology that will make the election process easier. According to the communications of the ACM, in November of 2000, over 93,991 voters failed to register for a vote for president. In 2002, using the direct recording electric technology, dropped the undervote to 0.86%. In order to reduce voter apathy, increase voter turnout, and ensure technology is used well to improve the voter experience, same-day voter registration shall be available in New York State. Thank you.
The second opening argument for the opposition team will be delivered by Elizabeth Simmons. Elizabeth, you will have up to 3 minutes to deliver your argument. You may begin when you're ready.
In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was created to protect and support the right to vote for the American people. But in June 2013, the Supreme Court overturned Section 5 of this act. Only weeks later, states began a new and horrifying trend. They enacted strict voter ID laws. These laws are discriminatory. They disenfranchise voters, particularly those with a low income, members of minorities, students, the elderly, and voters with disabilities. But this has not stopped 33 of the 50 states from enacting ID laws. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, any state enacting same-day registration must also enact some form of voter identification. 9 of the 14 SDR states have then enforced stricter photo identification regulations due to an increased fear of voter impersonation fraud. If our goal in enacting same-day registration in New York State is to increase voter turnout, how can we then disenfranchise those who do not have an ID? According to the American Civil Liberties Union, these regulations would take the right to vote away from 11% of the United States population. 11% may not seem like much, but it is equivalent to 21 million American citizens. You might be thinking, that's all of America. Of course the number is huge. But if we do the same math for only New York State, that is still equivalent to over 2 million American citizens, just like you and me, losing their right to vote. You might also be sitting there thinking, it can't be that bad. If you have a New York State license, you won't be included in these statistics. But that might not be true. Have you moved recently or gotten married? If this is the case and your ID does not reflect the change, you wouldn't be eligible to vote in the coming election. Instead of same-day registration making this process easier for us, its surrounding policies would take away this precious right that we are all here fighting for. And during this time of record low turnout for already registered voters, can we really afford to enact this costly and complicated policy? Instead, we should focus on increasing voters' belief that their voice matters. We could be educating our youth on how and where to register, not to mention when. There are so many more effective solutions to the problem at hand than same-day registration. We can do better than this. Thank you.
We're now entering the portion of the debate where we will have cross-examination questions. So we will have pairs of advocates coming up front. Representing the opposition team will be Shanna Schaff. Representing the affirmative will be Brittany Cummings. Shanna, you will be asking your question first. You have up to 1 minute to ask your question, and you may begin when you're ready.
Startup costs for same-day registration can cost up to $1.8 million for a single county in certain areas. Will County in Illinois has a startup cost of $1 million, while Kane County, Illinois has an estimated $1.8 million for their startup, which is why these counties were against enacting same-day registration. For counties in New York, which are struggling financially and that are expected to change their voting system, how are they expected to get this kind of money to cover their startup cost? If they were to increase the taxes of the individuals in the county, wouldn't this make the citizens angry? How can you justify implementing same-day registration in counties in New York that simply cannot afford it?
Brittany, you have up to 3 minutes to respond. You may begin when you're ready.
As to your question about the cost of same-day voter registration and how we can afford to make that change in the state of New York, my answer to that question is the state of Iowa recently enacted same-day voter registration. In order to enact same-day registration to its 99 counties, it only costed $40,000. $40,000 is much less than the millions the opposition is telling you. Same-day voter registration's cost is minimal. My team and I have done the research and the math. In order to enact same-day voter registration in the state of New York, it would cost around $25,000 for this state alone. The cost being minimal, there are many benefits to same-day voter registration, including increasing voter turnout, as you have heard, but also remedying inaccurate voter rolls. Many people who show up to vote on Election Day are turned away. Why is this? Because of clerical errors associated with Election Day processes. Former U.S. Representative Lincoln Davis is one of the many who have been turned away at the polls. Representative Lincoln Davis of Tennessee knows a little something about elections and government. He is a former U.S. representative. Yet this year, when he went to the polls in his hometown, where he has been voting since 1995, he was turned away. He says, "We walked in and they told me I was not a registered voter. I had been taken off the list." These are the people who he had grown up with. These are the people from his hometown. Think about that. A former U.S. representative was denied his right to vote. This can be every one of you in this room. Everyone has the same right to vote. Everyone has the right for their voice to be heard. And everyone has a choice to go and register on Election Day. Thank you.
Okay, Brittany, you will have up to 1 minute to ask a question. You may begin when you're ready.
As I have stated, the state of Iowa spent less than $40,000 to introduce same-day voter registration. The states such as Minnesota, Maine, and Wisconsin, among others, who have had same-day voter registration for at least 20 years, have also reported these minimal costs. How then do you oppose legislation that would be so helpful for so many and cost so little?
Shanna, you have up to 3 minutes to respond.
I understand your concern with the cost for same-day registration. And although for some states it may not cost as much, New York State is an exception. One example is Illinois. From the Daily Herald, their startup cost has a price tag of over $1 million. Their contract with their election systems is $878,000 just to update and implement their same-day registration system. This includes $553,000 just for voting tablets, and their extension cords cost $4,000 alone. In November of 2014, only 736 people took advantage of this same-day registration process out of a possible 388,000 people. Taking the contract into consideration, this came down to $1,200 per person who registered on that same day. In some rural areas, it could cost even more if they don't have the sufficient internet connections. According to the Gulag Bound, voter turnout only increased about 7 to 12%. So we have to think, is it worth spending that kind of money for such a low turnout? Right now, registration rates exceed 80%, but we're willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to make it easier for less than 20% of the population, when that 20% of the population doesn't even have to vote. Yes, it is our constitutional right to vote, but the Constitution doesn't make it mandatory. Some places cost less because they are up to date, but in New York, we would be paying absurd amounts of money for something that doesn't show significant results. A Lake County clerk from Illinois said that, "I hope the taxpayers appreciate it because it will cost them a lot of money, and the sad thing is that it hasn't really increased the voter turnout." The Obama campaign also called it a costly bill to address a non-existent problem. Of course, we want everyone to vote, but the negatives of same-day registration by far outweigh the positives. We don't want to implement something that could have such detrimental effects on the great state of New York. And for this, we don't believe same-day registration would be beneficial in New York State.
You may be seated. For our second pair, representing the opposition team will be Victoria Osascalo, and for the affirmative team, Shelby Gage. Victoria, you will have up to 1 minute to ask your question, and you may begin when you are ready.
For same-day voter registration to work, a prospective voter needs to prove that they are eligible to vote. This requires some form of identification. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, all same-day voter registration states require that voters present identification at the polling place. Some of these states, such as Wisconsin, require strict photo ID laws. Same-day voter registration will bring about another policy that can possibly turn away people at the polling places and disenfranchise many Americans. Why enact a policy that will disenfranchise many citizens and dissuade people from voting?
Shelby, you have up to 3 minutes to respond.
In regards to your question about voter ID laws, the fact is that whether you register at the polls on election day or whether you register at the DMV 40 days ahead of time, you need an ID. There's no way to get around needing an ID to register to vote. So unfortunately, it may cause some voter ID laws to be put in place. However, it'll help far more people than it would hurt. The 15th Amendment states that Congress has the right to enact appropriate legislation to keep our right to vote. My team and I would argue that this is such appropriate legislation. Passing a law enacting same-day voter registration would be simple, cost-effective, and would afford the ability to vote to so many disenfranchised populations who otherwise wouldn't. A policy paper on projectvote.com said that a same-day voter registration system can be introduced at low cost and becomes more cost-effective over time. This is in part because as more people register to vote, you're going to have less people that need to use the system. With at least 5 amendments to our Constitution related to voting rights, it's obvious that this is something that we hold very dear. Why would we continue to support a practice that discourages or even worse, prevents so many people from exercising that right? Thank you.
Shelby, you have up to 1 minute to ask your question, and you may begin when you are ready.
Sherry Holverson, a 50-year-old Army veteran, encountered multiple issues associated with motor voter law in her state when she attempted to update her information to include a change of address. When she arrived at her polling place to cast her vote, her name failed to appear on the roll, and she was given a provisional ballot.
which it was later confirmed was not counted. According to a U.S. Senate survey released by New York State Senator Charles Schumer in May of 2009, in the 2008 election, more than 1/4 of the ballots requested by U.S. military personnel deployed overseas went either uncollected or uncounted. How could you support current legislation that denies those people who put their lives on the line the right to shape the legislation that governs the country they so proudly serve?
Victoria, you have up to 3 minutes to respond.
I understand your concern with the disenfranchisement of different people in our country. But at the same time, we still don't support same-day voter registration for several reasons. One reason is that we need a plan in place. We need to know an amount of ballots to print out for each precinct. We need to know where each person needs to show up at their precinct. And we need to know how much machines to deploy also. Without that, we aren't prepared for how many people are going to show up. Now, the opposition might say that even though we have a plan, we see problems. But, for example, the CNN just published an article saying that the University of Buffalo sent out 5,000 fraudulent or emails by mistake saying that people were accepted to that college. So we see that sometimes plans do have glitches, and that is unfortunate. But we also see that there's another problem with same-day voter registration, such as fraud. In the Washington Post, we saw that one person voted 13 times for the governor. Think about that, 13 votes by one person. How can we enact a policy that will take away from the integrity of our election system? And for these reasons, we do not support same-day voter registration.
You may be seated. Our third pair for cross-examination, representing the opposition team, is Dylan Poor, and representing the affirmative is Jessica Murphy. Dylan, you will have up to 1 minute to ask your question. You may begin when you're ready.
Within many other countries throughout the world, there is a definite problem with sham elections and citizens' lack in their system of voting. This has been shown in places such as Syria, Russia, and Venezuela. Why would we want to enact a measure that would have any chance of allowing more people without the proper credentials to participate in voting for our leaders and decrease our citizens' faith in elections?
Jessica, you have 3 minutes to respond.
In response to your question about comparing the United States to other countries and voting credentials, I have a shocking statistic for you. Did you know that the U.S. has 15% less voter turnout than any other Western democracy? We are one of the largest democracies in the entire world, yet over half of our population does not reflect their right to vote because they are not registered. In regards to the topic of presenting credentials at the polls, if you're an American citizen, you possess a birth certificate, a green card, a social security card. You have proper identification, but you may not be registered. Like many in this room, you might be a college student. You do not live in your hometown, therefore you never bothered to register to vote because of the residency rules. You have to live in an area for 30 days prior to registering for election. In this 30 days, you might be on campus. You can go to your local precinct in the town where you go to school, such as Cazenovia, claim your residency as the college, register to vote, and cast a ballot. Every single person in this room possesses that capability. Do you want to use the knowledge that we are learning in this school on all of the people running to run our nation? Do you want to be the voice that gets to choose who gets to represent this country? Everyone has an opinion, and everyone should be allowed to reflect that opinion. The 15th Amendment made voting rights available for all, yet 31% of single women are not registered. 42% of 18 to 29-year-olds. That is the vast majority of the population of this room. 42% of the people in this room are not registered to vote. That is shocking and appalling. Same-day voter registration can change this for everyone, and therefore, my team and I support same-day voter registration.
Jessica, you have up to 1 minute to ask your question, and you may begin when you're ready.
51% of the lowest income bracket in the United States is not registered to vote. If more than half of these individuals are not registered to vote, then they are unable to elect the government officials who will properly represent them. These individuals are unable to register to vote due to the restrictions involved with standard voting registration. Same-day voter registration would allow these underrepresented individuals the opportunity to vote. How then can you not support an act that would allow equal representation for all?
Dylan, you have up to 3 minutes to respond.
I understand your question is in regards to same-day voter registration and it being discriminatory. And well, the fact is that with along comes same-day voter registration, also comes voter ID laws. Voter ID laws would discriminate against many people in our country. 9 out of the 14 states that have same-day registration also have strict photo voter ID laws, and 21 million Americans don't have photo IDs. Along with this comes many other negative effects from same-day voter registration. It leads to unorganization, as previously mentioned by my teammates. It comes with a high cost, and it could increase voter fraud. While some on the opposite team may say that voter fraud is not a problem, it is not a problem currently because of the system we have in place. There's nothing wrong with the system we have in place. Currently, it takes the same amount of time to register, whether you do it beforehand or at the poll. The only difference is when you'd show up at the poll, it would take longer time because you hadn't done it beforehand. The current policy also has some benefits. It helps increase the amount of informed voters. In between the 25 days you register to vote and the time you actually go to vote, you can do a lot of research on the candidates you go to vote for. Although I can agree with my opponents that there are some small benefits to same-day voter registration, they aren't worth the cost and do not outweigh the negatives or the potential it could cause for abuse to the system. Currently, our methods of voting and selecting officials are sufficient. Why try to fix something that isn't broken? Thank you.
Mike, do we have an extra microphone? Is it on the, it's over there. Is it really obvious? It's in the corner. She seems talented in so many ways, but she can't find the microphone. Okay, Liz. Liz Dobson, everybody, your microphone first. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. No pressure, but pressure, okay? This is a room full of largely college students, well-educated. You're going to be showing the high quality of your educational experience right here, right now. We need to have a question for each person we're going to call to the podium. And the first person we're going to call to the podium to take a question from the audience member is going to represent the affirmative team, Kyle McMahon. Okay, a question for Kyle. Okay. Liz is bringing the microphone. Can you tell us your name and your major here at the college?
My name is Catherine Meyer, and I am a sophomore in the Equine Business Management program here at Caz. I was recently denied my right to vote in the presidential Democratic primary election in April because I did not change my party affiliation before the deadline of October 9th. I felt cheated, I felt like my voice didn't matter, and I felt like my government was doing me a disservice. How do you feel that people just like me who are denied their right to vote because of party affiliation laws affect presidential primary results, and how do you feel that same-day voter registration could change this?
Oh, let's clap for that. That was good. Okay, Kyle, you will have up to 3 minutes to respond, and you may begin when you're ready.
I first want to thank you for being so brave to be the first one to go ahead and answer questions, as well as we want to, of course, apologize on behalf of our government for, not being able to represent you like you should be represented. But in regards to your question about party affiliation and voting, as my team has represented, as everyone here should know, and we all do know, we have the right to vote. You have the right to vote, and you deserve that right to vote. And party affiliation should never matter. A party affiliation is just left or right. It's never in the middle, and a lot of people are certainly in the middle. But that is all secondary to what voter registration can do for this state. Certainly, we can have those 51 million people in this country who are not even registered to vote. They have a voice. You have a voice as well. You should have been granted that right. And it was not fair that New York State has put in place barriers for people, college students like ourselves. And 18 to 24-year-olds, 41%, much like my team has mentioned, 41% of us are not registered to vote. And that is due specifically to time management. Obviously, we do not have the time. A lot of people do not have the time to go ahead and register to vote. A lot of people, first, you have, obviously students, like we mentioned before. We have those parents who can't just get out of work and pick up their children and then go register to vote. They need time to do this. And same-day voter registration allows for two things. Obviously, it allows them to go ahead and register, and then it allows them to vote. And we all deserve that right. Thank you.
All right, speaking on behalf of the opposition, Alicia Madonia. Okay, a question for Alicia. A question for Alicia. I'm not above calling on people. I can do that. Go right ahead. Liz is coming with the microphone. Can you tell us who you are, please?
Danny Sleeth. Amanda's a student here. She's my daughter.
Okay. All right. We can hear you fine. So
I like this kind of stuff.
You can go ahead and ask your question.
Voting is a sacred duty for every American. Whose fault is it that on voting day someone is not registered to vote? Is there any personal responsibility in the fact that they aren't registered to vote?
You have up to 3 minutes to respond.
Thank you for your question. And to answer that, you're absolutely right. A lot of it does have to do with yourself. If you find the time to pre-register before the actual election, and with same-day registration, there are a lot of flaws that come with this that we need to acknowledge, such as voter fraud, the high price that comes with it, and voter ID laws. In Wisconsin, over 33% of the same-day voter registration submitted during an April 5th, 2011 election contained at least one type of error. 1,995 of these errors were no proof of residency. And the cost that comes with same-day registration just doesn't make it worth it. In Kane County, Illinois, it cost $1.8 million for same-day registration. That's $16,000 per polling place. And in Lake County, startup costs for same-day registration were $1 million. With same-day registration comes voter ID laws. And as many as 11% of the United States citizens, that's more than 21 million individuals, do not have a government-issued photo identification. So these citizens are being disenfranchised by same-day registration. We should pull our focus from same-day registration and strive to have informed voters. Now, my opponents have been arguing that it doesn't say in the Constitution that you have to be informed in order to vote. But it also doesn't say in the Constitution that you have to study if you're going to attend college. But are you going to? Of course. In order to be successful in the classes you take, you're going to study the material you are tested on. And in order to feel confident on who you decide to vote for, you're going to do your research. Matthew Gannon, a former staffer of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, said, The only people I want anywhere near the ballot box are those who have demonstrated that they are actually invested in the process and want to vote. That is the flaw with same-day registration. Most of the people it serves are unengaged in the process. There are indeed things in life that we don't need too much thought before coming to a final decision. Voting should not be one of them. And for these reasons, we cannot support same-day registration.
Speaking on behalf of the affirmative will be Giandre White. Okay, question is over this way for Giandre. Liz is coming, hang on. We can't hear you on the webcast without the microphone. Poor Liz. It's a workout for Liz, folks. Okay. Can you tell us who you are? Are you a student here? And if so, what is your major?
My name is Tatiana. I'm a student here, and I study fashion merchandise.
Okay, we can hear you fine. So you can ask your question when you're ready.
Okay. In regards to same-day voter registration, how is this method more economically feasible than the current method of pre-registration? And where would the funding be coming from without costing taxpayers in higher populated areas more like someone like myself who is from Manhattan?
Giandre, you have up to 3 minutes to reply.
So, regards to your question about the funding and things like that with same-day voter registration, the cost is very minimal. I don't think putting a cost on your rights is fair or constitutional, in my opinion. This is not okay. Same-day voter registration opens the doors for many demographics like myself, Black Americans who usually don't express their rights to vote, single parents who have jobs and they're busy and they can't go vote, and students like ourselves that fill up this lecture hall. We have 5, 6 classes, internships, jobs, extracurricular activities. It's not fair. We just don't have the time. Same-day voter registration is something that we need in New York State. I believe that we need to do anything and everything possible to get the highest voter turnout rate, and that is what matters in the state of New York. And implementing same-day voter registration is what needs to be done. Thank you.
Speaking for the opposition is Ty Zielinski. Okay, got a question for Ty. Hold on, Liz is going to hand over the microphone. Yeah, just go easy. Mike will harm me if it's harmed. All right, Tabitha, can you tell us who you are, please, and your major?
I'm Tabitha. I'm an education major. So my question's a lot simpler than those ones. If voters turnout is gonna increase, which they stated it, even if it's by a little, wouldn't you want that? Like, why would you oppose that, even if it's gonna increase?
Okay.
Ty, you have up to 3 minutes.
Good evening, and thank you for your question. I understand your concerns regarding voter turnout and same-day voter registration, but let me tell you why the increase in voter turnout with same-day voter registration in New York is insignificant. It is important for us to understand that there are many factors that contribute to every decision people make. Like, I'm sure many of us in here remember all the factors that weighed on their decision to come to Cazenovia. The distance away from home, financial aid, and if there was a rolling deadline or not. When you apply to a school with a rolling deadline, like Caz, there's less pressure to send an application in on a timely manner. When people utilize same-day voter registration, they do it because it is available to them. When we cannot discount the adaptability of our people to regulations. We live in an orderly society, and for the most part, people abide by the regulations we decide on as a society. For us to say that same-day voter registration is single-handedly responsible for an increase in voter turnout gives our policy too much credit and our people not enough. Same-day voter registration may have minimal increases in voter turnout, but we have to recognize that other factors play a role in voter turnout as well. Having an increase in voter education for our people will increase voter turnout, and it's not single-handedly, same-day voter registration is not single-handedly responsible for this. Pre-registering to vote is our current system, and it is enacted, and same-day voter fraud in our current system is seemingly non-existent, okay? Implementing same-day voter registration in the state of New York will open the door for this issue. Why would we want to change our current system where this problem is not existent? For these reasons, my team and I do not agree with implementing same-day voter registration in the state of New York. Thank you.
Speaking for the affirmative is Allie Miller. All right, Allie is doing a double because we have an odd number of speakers tonight. So Liz is coming for the question in the back. Can you tell us who you are and your major, please?
My name is Caitlin. I'm an English major.
Thank you, Caitlin. We can hear you fine, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
My question is, which causes more disenfranchisement of underrepresented voters, ID laws or registration deadlines? And what evidence do you see of this?
Allie, you have up to 3 minutes.
I understand that your question is about which causes more disenfranchisement to the voters, our registration laws or IDs laws. And I'm here to tell you that although the opposition has stated that ID laws are still going to stop a lot of people from coming out to polls, same-day voter registration, however, shows that that's not the case. Over 1.5 million Americans used same-day voter registration to vote in the 2012 presidential election, and voter turnout was over 11 percentage points higher in the 9 states that permitted registration and voting on the same day last November. Now, same-day voter registration offers many benefits, and although photo IDs can be inhibitors, there's many other factors that allow same-day voter registration to be embraced with much need and stop the disenfranchisement of voters. Research indicates that same-day voter registration could increase youth turnout in presidential elections by as much as 14 percentage points. That includes students just like yourself and I, who, although we're far away from home sometimes and don't have the chance to get out necessarily to register all the time, it allows those people just like us to get the opportunity to do that. Now, one area that hasn't really been touched on is, it's always been touched that it's the procrastination of those who have not gotten out to register. But what same-day registration can allow for people is the 18-year-old girl who due to her parents' circumstances, had to move 30 days prior to the day of election. Now, she was informed on who was running, she's done the education, she's waited her 18 years and was informed and accurately knew what she was doing. But because of a 30-day registration of living in the same place where you have to live in to vote, she was denied her right to vote. Same-day voter registration will allow those people who are informed and have put the time and energy in making an informed decision, the right and the availability to have the opportunity to vote. And for these reasons, my team and I support same-day voter registration.
Speaking for the opposition is Kavanaugh Chairs. Okay, question for Cav. Okay, Liz, we're going to get the microphone to you. If you notice, like, everyone's in the middle tonight. It's just a middle question kind of night. Can you tell us who you are and your major?
Okay. My name is Yvette, and I'm an international studies major.
Okay, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, my question to you is that your team has been saying, why would we want to change the current system a lot? Would you not look at our current presidential race as highlighting that consistent misrepresentation of the people have allowed for the spectacle that we see on our television screens right now?
Cav, you have up to 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you for your question. In regards to the madness that we see on TV, I would say it's more of having misinformed voters. TV shows a lot more than people really that spend the time to do the research actually shows. We just see who comes out and votes for who. I think if we were to spend more of our time and more of our resources on educating voters instead of implementing same-day voter registration, we could see just as much of a turnout. You know, same-day voter registration will, at some point, bring some more voters in. But when you look at the 2008 election, we had 131 million voters come out and vote, and 15 million of these voters came out for the first time, not because of same-day voter registration, but this was because of the candidates that were running. You know, so like you said, you know, people come out and vote for certain candidates because they like that candidate. You know, this isn't because same-day voter registration. And, you know, with same-day voter registration, we also see the increase in costs, as my team has said. You know, we can be looking at $1 million, $1.8 million just to have a startup cost for these counties. You know, small counties like Madison County, you know, I don't think we could really afford $1 million hit just to start up same-day voter registration when it's proven that in the 2008 election, more people turn up for a candidate that they like. You know, so for these reasons, I do not support same-day voter registration.
Speaking for the affirmative, Justice Armstrong. Okay, a question for Justice. This is the last question for the affirmative, so if you've been waiting for this moment, this is it, people. It's like the opportunity is about to leave the building right now. It's a steal of a deal. Here we go. One question for the affirmative. Go ahead, Liz. Hit it.
Okay, so I'm Liz, and I'm a communication studies major. I'm also the mic person. But so earlier in the debate, someone mentioned the number of $25,000 that it would cost to implement in New York to implement same-day voter registration. I want to know where that number came from and how it was calculated.
Okay, Justice, you have up to 3 minutes.
I understand your question is about cost and how we came up with the $25 million. $25,000. So our team took the cost that has been implemented by the other 10 states that has been successful for same-day voting registration, and we took that from the 99 counties and we divided it on how much it would cost by those counties, and then we took that number and we divided that by the number of counties in Madison or in New York to get that number. So that's how that number became. So the cost really isn't a big factor, as the opposition has said. It is going to cost money. Everything costs money. But if you think about what same-day voter registration does for what it will do for New York, it will close the voting gap. It will increase voting turnouts. It will allow people like you and I to not have to wait those 25 days to vote. We can go on the day. It will help so many more people. And in regards to education and same-day voting registration, what my team and I have to say about that is we don't need to implement educating those who are going to vote or choosing same-day voter registration. We can imply both. You can be educated and we can still have voting registration in New York State. This is why my team and I have decided that same-day voting registration will be a great asset to New York. Thank you.
All right. Closing out the questions for the audience, we have Russell Young speaking for the opposition, and a question from the middle. Liz. Oh, look. It's that Jack Underhill. Liz is bringing the microphone over. Can you tell us, please, who you are and where you're from?
My name is Jack Underhill. I'm a sophomore in high school.
Okay, and we can hear you fine, so go right ahead with your question.
On numerous occasions, speakers opposed to same-day registration have mentioned that education could be a viable alternative to this. However, I'd like to mention that education programs and incentives also cost money. Do you believe that the cost for these programs would be less than or more valuable than the cost for implementing same-day voter registration?
Russell, you have up to 3 minutes.
Hello, and thank you for your question. Like the opposition just said, they could use both same-day voter registration and education. I do believe that we do need more education on voting, and I don't think the cost of educating our citizens should really come into play with the right to vote. But also, if we do implement same-day voter registration, we would have laws disproportionately disenfranchising African Americans, Latinos, the poor, students, the elderly, and disabled. If we disenfranchise people, we're taking a step backwards and not a step forward. According to the National Conference of State Legislature of California, they don't have the same-day registration yet because statewide voter registration database complies with the requirements of the Federal Help America Vote Act, which mandates that anyone who hasn't registered to vote must show some form of voter identification at registration time or at the polls if they haven't showed it at registration time. In our country, we've had literacy tests in the 1850s and through into the 1960s that have prevented and disenfranchised many Americans. We do not want to take a step back and disenfranchise many more Americans, such as the 11%, the 21 million that we could disenfranchise that do not have identification or a way to show their residency. We believe that same-day voter registration does not work in the great state of New York because of the many disadvantages and threats it could impose. Same-day registration would lead to more cases of fraud in the state, where we can see that there's little to no fraud in the current voter registration system. This would ultimately lead to the stricter voter ID laws that would disenfranchise our people. And for those reasons, I do not believe that same-day voter registration should be enacted. Thank you.
All right, audience, you did well. You did well. You held up your end of the bargain. Good for you. I think we should clap for the audience. Let's clap. Okay. We now turn to the rebuttal statements from each team. Speaking first for the opposition team will be Tay Terry. Tay, you will have up to 3 minutes to deliver your argument. You may begin when you're ready.
Today we have heard arguments from both the affirmative and the opposition regarding whether or not we should implement same-day voter registration in New York State. While our opponents have made some valid points, we need to carefully evaluate the practicality of them. Same-day voter registration presents risks of chaos and guarantees higher costs. New York State is one of the most populous states in our nation, and for us to implement same-day voter registration, we would have astronomical costs that would benefit none of our taxpayers. HeraldNews.com reports that it will cost the state of New York almost $1 million per county to implement same-day voter registration. In theory, this new law might increase voter turnout, but there is no concrete evidence that supports this theory. And spending millions of dollars on a system that has no definitive result is ill-considered. If we want to increase voter turnout, the best alternative is to invest in voter education and increase public awareness about the voting process. The affirmative would like you to believe that the registration process now is cumbersome and inconvenient, but the truth is, it's as simple as buying tickets for a play on will call before showing up to the theater. Citizens who plan to vote have ample means to register before Election Day. We can register online at any time on sites such as turbovote.org, youramerica.com, or even Facebook. Voter education is a better course of action than same-day voter registration, because voter education will shield us from any risk of voter fraud or voter ID laws that would disenfranchise our people. It is fair to say that our current system is not perfect, but without tighter voter ID laws, same-day voter registration would invite fraud. In 9 of the states that practice same-day voter registration, voters are required to show a state ID and a proof of residence to cast a ballot, provisional or otherwise. But voter ID laws are discriminatory to people who are young and or impoverished because they have less access to a driver's license or state ID. Proper planning is really important when it comes to voting because like other significant decisions, like going to college, getting a driver's license, buying a house, and getting married, it requires time and forethought. No one is discriminated against by planning ahead. If we all pre-register before Election Day, we can arrive at our respective polling places on Election Day, sign our signature, and vote. That's the way it's been. That's the way it should stay. As the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Thank you.
Delivering the rebuttal statement for the affirmative team is Samuel Braun. Sam, you have up to 3 minutes. And you may begin when you are ready.
"25. That's the number of days before the election you currently have to register to vote in New York State. 25 days in advance. Why 25? It's not 24, it's not 26, it's 25. It's a nice round little number. It just sounds good. If I sound like I'm grasping at straws for a reason here, it's because I am. There's no reason that the cutoff has to be precisely 25 days. Like I said, it just kind of sounds good. That's not science. Nobody ran lab experiments and said, you know what, we tried 20 days and the whole thing just fell apart. It's a totally arbitrary number. Why should we have to wait that long? People are fickle. We change our minds and make decisions in a matter of hours. 25 days is almost a month. Think about how much you get done in an entire month. As college students, a lot of us have been spending the last month studying for finals. A lot of you out there in the audience might have spent the last month working on huge, important projects for your jobs. Now imagine if your boss, your teacher, whoever, were to tell you, hey, so I've decided that all your work needs to be done 25 days before the deadline from now on. Good luck. It's not necessarily finished. It hasn't technically been handed in yet, but you get to stand there and stare at it for the next 25 days and think about all the things you might have done differently. That's ridiculous, right? How is it fair for someone to impose an arbitrary deadline on you when you know full well you have more time to get that done? Is there any benefit to making your life harder, to making it more difficult for you to do your work? There isn't. Some might argue that the 25-day cutoff could keep indecisive, uneducated voters out of the election. That's a little harsh. And that statement's not just a wee bit judgmental. That's contrary to the idea this entire democracy is founded on. Your vote, as an American, counts for just as much as someone who's indecisive or uneducated, because they are also an American. Your vote and theirs should count for just as much as the president's, because he's also an American. Having a 25-day cutoff, therefore making it more difficult for certain people to vote, for whatever reason you want to tell yourself that's okay, is un-American. In conclusion, same-day voter registration would put an end to the 25-day cutoff, because a 25 is a pointless, arbitrary number of days to have to register in advance. There's no actual decision-making process that leads to that number besides, we need a number. 25 is nice and round. And as long as we're making these big, important decisions based on nice, round little numbers, I can think of one: 0. Thank you.
Okay, closing arguments. Delivering the closing argument for the opposition team is Brianna Manley. Brianna, you have up to 4 minutes, and you may begin when you're ready.
The first Women's Rights Convention was held about an hour away from here in Seneca Falls in 1848 to discuss women's suffrage. In 1920, women received the right to vote. On August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, authorizing the U.S. Attorney General to send federal examiners to register black voters and suspend all literacy tests which had been disenfranchising black Americans for over a century. How many women were arrested and died for the right to vote? How many black Americans died so their fellow Americans could have this right? I am black. I am a woman, and I do not take my right to vote lightly. We have something very special in America. Not only do we have a right that cannot be diminished, but we have faith in democracy. In Colombia, about 80% of their citizens do not have faith in their politicians. In contrast, according to Gallup polling, 94% of Americans do not share that belief. In 2015 alone, there was controversy about general elections in Egypt, Sri Lanka, the Sudan, Ethiopia, and Myanmar. We are fortunate enough in America that We do not have skepticism overshadowing our elections. But same-day voter registration poses a whole slew of threats to that faith. Same-day voter registration cannot be effective without tighter voter ID laws. To have it be any other way would simply be inviting fraud into a system where fraud is essentially non-existent. Voter ID laws disenfranchise people of lower incomes and minorities. A recent study from the University of California shows that there's evidence showing that there's a significant degree of voter suppression of people of color by voter ID laws. It also cites other research that suggests that voter ID requirements tend to be enforced more stringently on people of color. Voter ID laws create a new, lower class of citizen voters. And we will see an influx in that if we allow same-day voter registration. These onerous ID requirements are no different from the literacy tests that Black Americans had to take. They are no different from the property requirements that we enacted in the 1700s. Same-day voter registration will lead us down a path of disenfranchisement, and we cannot allow that to happen. Not in New York.
And delivering the closing argument for the affirmative team is Brandy LaBounty. Brandy, you will also have 4 minutes, up to 4 minutes, to deliver your argument. You may begin when you're ready.
I am an American citizen. You are an American citizen. And our right to vote is stated clearly in the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the federal and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. We all have the right to have our voices heard and to elect the officials that represent us through the democratic process of the United States. A process which has been so famously summed up by President Abraham Lincoln. America was built on the promise of equal political representation in order to secure a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. But America cannot work as a democracy if the 51 million eligible voters are not given every opportunity to vote. I pose the question, what purpose does the 25-day gap between the New York registration deadline and the election serve the election process? What purpose does it serve the democratic process? What purpose does it serve to the people? According to Sean McElwee, a noted policy analyst, 41% of non-voters say that they don't bother to vote because their vote doesn't matter anyway. However, the affluent Americans who turn up to vote at exceptionally high rates will not share this view. McElwee stated that 59% of non-voters don't pay attention to politics because nothing ever gets done and it's a bunch of empty promises. If a single one of you out there tonight feel as though your vote does not make a difference and as though you can't influence what gets done in an election, then I tell you this. If we do not close the turnout gap between the middle-aged, affluent white men, low-income families, Black citizens, youth, and women, then our democracy is destined to become less and less representative of who we are as a nation, who we are as American citizens. Same-day voter registration is not going to be the gateway to fraud, as the opposition may believe. Same-day voter registration is the difference between an Army veteran, a young Black woman, a low-income single mother of 3, and a handicapped citizen who requires assistance, having their vote count towards the candidate that best reflects them. Of the 10 states that have enacted same-day voter registration, greater than 1.5 million voters have utilized this change in policy. According to the U.S. Elections Project, this is a 10% increase in overall voter turnout. If one vote doesn't matter, then tell that to the 1.5 million American citizens who stood up and made a difference in 2012, because that could be you.
now going to have a few minutes while the judges tabulate the scores. I'd like to thank all of you for the excellent questions and the support of the advocates. I'd like to particularly thank the judges, and the winner of tonight's debate is the opposition team. Thank you and good night.